Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new Urban AI conversation. That's actually the first Urban AI conversation of the year. So I'm also wishing you a joyful and wonderful new year. And we have the pleasure for this first episode of 2026 to being joined by Bianca Wylie. Hi, Bianca.
Hey there.
So we're going to discuss many topics actually today, and it's really a great pleasure and a great honor actually of have you in this podcast. First question is actually very easy, but could you introduce yourself?
Certainly. Thank you. It's really nice to be here. And I appreciate the chance to talk about all the things you've been talking about for years. My name is Bianca. I'm joining you from Toronto. And I'm really excited to talk with you about how to talk about technology, because I think that is the constant part of my life that just seems to stay beside me. I have background in a few different places. I've worked in the tech sector, I've worked in public consultation, and I've been working lately on policy and advocacy in the last chapter of my work. I'm starting a new one, which I'm happy to tell you about, but I've got a new studio. It's called Time and Space Studios. And that is a result of, I think, what I've learned through the years. So just keep learning. So hopefully we can learn together, and happy to share more. I will say one more thing, because I'm joining you from Toronto, and because I don't know what it's like in France, but we're having a lot of conversations about sovereignty, digital sovereignty. And Canada is a colonial nation. And I have this ongoing work to do and learn and to talk about relations with Indigenous peoples in Canada, and how that is part of all the conversations we're having about whether it's sovereignty, digital or otherwise. So I just wanted to share a book in case anyone's joining us from Toronto. It's called Indigenous Toronto, and it helps tell some stories. I think that maybe for some, learning history is challenging. There's a very long history. Toronto's history is long and complex, but super interesting, and we can learn a lot now about how to manage the times we're in now by learning, more about our history. So just given that I'm joining from Toronto, I wanted to start there because I will be touching on some of the things that I've been learning there as well.
Amazing. Thanks so much, really, for sharing. We will indeed be discussing on indigenous knowledge, actually, probably at the end of this podcast, and also your current work with Time and Space Studio. By the way, feel free to let us know in the chat where you are based, actually. I know very often we have a kind of global audience. It's also a way for us of traveling with you, knowing from where you're talking. So feel free to let us know. And if you have comments, reaction, feel free to share them, obviously, in the chat. Bianca, I might have a first question, actually. So you shared, in a sense, your journey and that you learned through your journey. Maybe we could go back a few years earlier during the Sidewalk Labs episode, because you really had kind of strong ethical positions during this episode. Can you maybe first explain for people that don't know what is Sidewalk Labs, what is it, and what was the aim of this project?
Yes. And I think I like that you brought up the word ethics, because we're talking about AI and we'll talk about cities. And I think that Sidewalk Labs and Sidewalk Toronto was a lot about decision making, and democracy is a lot about decision making, and governance is a lot about decision making. And that's a very helpful place to talk about ethics, is in how we make decisions. Not necessarily that you'll ever have a technology that can be ethical. In this case, Sidewalk Toronto was a smart city project. So I'll give you a little bit of context. But I think it's nice to start talking in non-technical terms about some of these issues we've had with technology and society. And so if you think about decision-making as a unit, that's where you can do ethics. And back in 2017, I believe, there was an announcement in Toronto that Waterfront Toronto, which, without getting into too much of the detail here, it's a public real estate company that was comprised of the City of Toronto, the Province of Ontario, and the federal government, the Canadian government. They looked after a very large parcel, and still do, parcel of land that is beside the City of Toronto. It's really part of it, but if you can imagine the developed part of the City of Toronto, big piece of land that is undeveloped. And they jointly manage that land through that entity. And they announced they had selected Sidewalk Labs, which was a Google sister company, to develop a small piece of that property to be a smart city. And I'm not even 100% sure where the term came into play. The idea was to try to think about sustainability, and Sidewalk Labs talked about doing development from the internet up. So there was a strong component of technology, but there was a lot about sustainability, climate, real estate development. So when that project was announced, I had been working, I've already worked in the tech sector, and I was doing some civic technology work, and as I still do. And it was interesting because it was announced as though it was just a good thing, like, be excited, we're going to make a plan for this smart city together. And this is how the leaders of both Sidewalk Labs and Waterfront Toronto talked. And they did a newspaper article, and they said, this is your plan, this is your idea, we're here to listen, let's see what we can do together. And then for the next 2.5 years, there was a very messy conversation that happened in the city. It didn't go, I would say, according to plan. And it really highlighted a lot of the tensions that get brought up when we mix technology and, I'd say, urbanism, but also society and democracy and money and real estate and power. So it was a very, you kind of had everything going on in that project. And at the end of it, Sidewalk Labs quit the project, and they said, this is not, and I believe the rationale was because COVID had just started. So that was the official reason, was that this wasn't financially viable. But the project was really a drawn out conversation about many things relating to real estate development, technology, smart cities. And for me, the way I participated in that along the way was just really with a lot of other people asking questions about, like, how exactly is this going to work? Which is a spectacularly productive tactic. And I think sometimes we all think we have to know what the answer should be to a question. But this became a very first local, and then people were watching from other cities, conversation about how would we want to live? Do we want to live with technology wired through much of the city? And I'll just stop there and say that I think everyone can look at that project and see a different story. So I'm telling you the story as I experienced it. You could probably invite 20 other people that were involved, and they'd give you 20 other stories. But I think one thing that really got downplayed, and it's why I started there, and it also brings us back to land, is that there was a significant real estate deal going on, where it was sort of described as a little pilot project, but there was actually a design to try to develop a very large piece of undeveloped real estate. And that's a different conversation than a smart city conversation or a, technology conversation. So all these things were going on sort of concurrently, and the technology piece seemed to float to the top in terms of the public discourse in some, in my circles and others, but there was a lot going on there. So hopefully that's helpful. If you want to ask me more questions, go for it.
Yeah, definitely. In your opinion, what was missing actually from these projects, and maybe also more broadly from smart city projects in general?
So this one in particular, you can track it right back to the procurement. And I know you had, I think Emily Benet-Royal has been a guest here. She's done a lot of fantastic work on procurement. Procurement, in this case, played a factor because the governments together, they put out a tender or a request for proposals that actually shifted the governance design to a private actor. No one in the city of Toronto asked for that. So if you want to bring this all the way home to where did this go wrong, that was not on, and that it was always and still is challenging to bring it back to that piece. But it's such a consistent theme, which is who's making decisions about how we live together, and how much, once technology is more and more embedded in our social, cultural, democratic system, how much power is sitting on the public side where you can hold someone accountable, and how much on the private side where you have no democratic accountability. So the core problem in my eyes was the procurement of this. There's lots of ways you can do that differently, but I think it's a mistake to just skip that and go into like, oh, the plan should have been this, or there should have been this design, or there should have been a policy agreement. Like, no one asked to privatize democratic governance of the city. So that was on the government agencies together in the city, that there was an error in the tender, so to speak.
So a company in its functions, its missions, and even its role in its words, actually, how they were speaking, was acting like a state, like a public entity, while it not. This is what you're saying.
Absolutely. And I remember going to a meeting, one of the first meetings, and my eyes were closed listening to some of what both the CEOs of both the public agency and the company were saying. And you could listen, and you said they both sound like the government, and neither of them technically are democratically accountable directly to the people that live here. So it was a very problematic structure, even all the way over to the public side. And I don't want to get mired, and it's complicated in terms of the structuring, but that still isn't really a publicly accountable body, even though it's represented by 3 orders of government, the Waterfront Toronto side. But yes.
Do you believe that the structural narrative behind what happened at this moment, so the privatization of public spaces, is inevitable? Is it something we will see more and more in the future, because we have like governments, local or national governments might have less resources? Or do you still believe there are counter narratives that can emerge?
Well, I think lots of counter narratives can emerge, and I think and work and friction. And I think I've got piles of books by my elbow here, but Angela Davis, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. Like, this is one of these things here where it's not just going to hold, power continually accrues. And so the way to continually fight for, more power on the public side, the side of a resident, side of collectives, is you're going to have counter narratives. I would say a couple of things. One of them is the technology that keeps being developed. So long as we live in a militarized world, it is fairly inevitable that it's going to keep coming into civilian life. So that's something that we need to understand, is that, sometimes we say, oh, is this inevitable? It's like right now it kind of is in a militarized, as a dominant paradigm. It will keep getting funded by national defense. As long as countries have enemies, they have a reason to say we need to fund this defense investment. And so much technology has its start in a military context. And on top of that, in a military context, you don't need to have a business model. So you have real pure R&D happening that eventually leaks out into civilian life, use, product, right? So the second question, or to connect it more directly to your question, I think this ongoing commercialization, privatization, like how we pull value from land, has already been a very troubling paradigm since, I would say, the beginning of the idea of private land. That's not the only way that we can manage land. But I think in most cities, the dominant capitalist paradigm is to extract what's the maximum value you can extract from this parcel of land. And if that's what the government is seeking to do, then it will always find partners in the private sector. So I think their incentives are already aligned there. So I think a lot of the public and private paradigm isn't that helpful anymore, because there's so much joint interest in the same thing. And I would say the same in the technology domain, because so much technology is developed because of economic development potential. So if the government wants it to be the market, and if the private sector is developing, they're both kind of pointing in the same direction. There's not any friction between those two paradigms. So I think all of these things are, I wouldn't say inevitable, they're more just sort of the status quo. And I think technology accelerates, generally speaking, power dynamics of the status quo. But there will always be counter narrative, and there will always be friction to create. And I think we're all going to keep doing it because we want to live together differently, I think, than what we feel is sort of the dominant method in a lot of our cities.
We're going to talk about accelerationism. Just before to share maybe two kind of stories on what you shared, I think really the Sidewalk Lab project and in a sense the failure or the fact that this project stopped, it really and we've been doing a lot of research collaboration with Urbania and some of our partners, and we could really saw that following this project, you had a kind of shift in smart city narratives. So I think really, in a sense, the work you've been doing here and more broadly, this episode, it was very critical in the history of smart city and in the small history of Urbania. If I can share this short story, actually, just before launching Urbania, I did a world tour, a smart city world tour. So I went in very different smart cities. And actually, the project that was inspiring me was Sidewalk Labs in the beginning. You know, like I was still a student 7 years ago. And I remember I was reading with fascination their yellow paper, you know, all the technologies, everything. And I was really amazed. And actually, it's during this journey, during this world tour, that gradually I met people, and I read also some of your articles that were criticizing, in a sense, some elements, some components of this narrative. And it was, I have to say, very enriching to have this kind of shift in terms of perspective. So that was just a small parenthesis, but I really had to share it in a sense.
I appreciate it.
So, you recently published an article, and actually we published it in our social media on decomputing, which is really a fascinating article. I think I first read it because Anthony Townsend commented it on your social media feed, and you are first starting this article with the concept of algorithmic silence. Can you explain what is it?
So this term came from a historian of technology. His name's Johnny Penn. And so I think this paper that he wrote that I quoted is from 2021. But basically, algorithmic silence is the idea of not having something, right? Rather than continually fine-tuning, saying it's standards compliant, saying it's got a responsible committee board that looks at it, This is actually saying maybe less, maybe we need to understand that mounting the complexity of these systems is a very daunting, attention requiring undertaking. So his suggestion is just to understand that instead of constantly reforming, engaging with these technologies, saying that we're going to mediate them somehow, or we're going to govern them, or we're going to do whatever, it's like maybe we just don't need to have as much. And that's the read of that. He would give you a much better expansive definition. He goes on in the paper, but I think what matters is this idea, and I think silence is such an important component of discussion, of listening, of learning. Our Western dominant culture is very solutions oriented. What are we doing? Just do something. So I also like that it gestures at the idea of quiet, so it's not just less of the thing. It's also like, let's not introduce this noise because we've got a lot of old noise we haven't dealt with. So maybe we would be better to put our attention elsewhere. But that's the idea. What I really liked about his paper, and it's the piece I quoted, was just this call to tech critics to become aware that they themselves become part of the problem. They become part of this technocratic mass where it's like, is this doing anything or is this busy work? Like, is this mitigating something that just shouldn't be there? Because that concept of technocracy and managerial, just like, let's just put more people on the problem and put more meetings on the thing and, put all this energy here. I think we really have to look at whether we're approaching the problem at the right piece, radical in its genesis of, the root. Like, are we looking at a root problem when we do technocratic algorithmic twiddling, or are we kind of out at the edge? And I'd argue a lot of the time we're out at the edge. So that was the start of the paper. And then it goes on. It's not a paper. Mine is just it's a post basically. But yeah, that's that concept. But I would encourage people to read his full piece because it's lovely.
You say later you write later in this paper, in this article, peeling ever more amounts of new computing systems in our lives can be dangerous in the context of equity, democracy, and accountability. Can you explain this idea?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think we all need to be very critical of ourselves when we look at technical governance and ask, like, are we just dealing with the symptom? Because I don't think we even have time to keep adding more literacies and engagements and, is this the appropriate place to try to manage some of these issues, which at their fundamental, at their root, if you look at colonialism is an ongoing system in Canada, for example. Sovereignties are not respected. Treaties where they exist, it's not across the whole country, they are not respected. So that's one example. Poverty. It was just Martin Luther King Jr. Day in the United States. Poverty, racism, militarism. Those are issues that, yes, we need to try to mitigate their consequence in a technology, but we really just need to deal with those issues at the root. And then a lot of the technology becomes less dangerous. And I think that's what we need to understand and think about, is that instead of trying to address these symptoms in these technologies, if we address them at their root, the technologies are less dangerous. And that's if we want to be efficient, that's actually a more efficient way to manage the issues that I was writing about there. It doesn't mean, to be clear, that you don't like that these are bad ideas or we should try to not, get reduced bias or like all of these are important things to do. It's just a matter of understanding that those are mitigations, right? Like that's like a symptom management. If you're sick, yes, you want to manage your symptoms, but there's a holistic health question that you really want to try to address, which is try to proactively be, how are we well as a society and collectively? Those issues are not technology issues. Those are social democratic issues.
That really resonates so much with some of our research and with our work, the fact that technology might be a distraction to kind of more essential discussions. Like we really saw after ChatGPT, like Urban AI, I created it before ChatGPT, 3 years before, and we saw after ChatGPT a kind of hype and many people, coming to us telling we want to do AI. And we were like, yes, but why? Why do you want, what's the mission? What's the purpose of this? What's the political vision? So yeah, that's really resonates a lot what you're sharing.
Well, and I also just would encourage us to wonder at least consider, is it almost escapist? To say, well, I'm working on you see people get very fired up about human rights and justice and social justice in the context of technology. And it's like, yes, good. How are we doing on housing? How are we doing on poverty? How are we doing on domestic violence? And it's not that it's one or the other. It's just understanding that you need to be able to carry both at the same time. And I think that one of the disappointing things I learned about my government was sort of a realization of how many things are people looking at once? Not that many. if you look at an elected representative or government, or they have a certain number of priorities, I think we have to be realistic about how much collective capacity we have. And I think, finally, I'm a believer in representative governance and government, which is to say we don't all have to come in on each issue, because I don't think we know enough. I barely know anything after staring at some of this stuff for a long time, just one small, narrow domain. So I also think we have to have trust that certain pieces of this get done by people in appropriate and accountable roles. And we don't all have to come in on it. Like, I'll end by saying, like, AI literacy, like, why do I have to learn about AI? Like, I got a lot of other stuff to do. This isn't necessary. And it's not to say if you're interested or if you want to be, like, great, but shoving this ongoing technical responsibility onto people, I think we have to, again, question how much capacity is there? What's the interest level? How should this work? Because it's been the rallying cry in Canada around AI legislation, myself included, was, well, there was no democratic process. And then you turn around and you think, what would a democratic process look like with something as generic as automation? Like, what does that even mean to have a democratic public consultation? It's a lot, right? So then you start to say, are we just dealing with the secondary politics? And I have ideas on how you could have some of those conversations. But I think this is just very important to not just say, oh, well, it's anti-democratic. It's like, okay, cool. Keep walking me out here. If you were going to run a public meeting, can you tell me how that would go? It doesn't necessarily make sense with some of these topics on the technical governance.
You also share in the same article an avenue of solution by reinvesting maintenance and care. Actually, can you maybe elaborate on this idea, because it also connects on what you're just sharing, the fact that maybe we should invest some deeper works in a sense and reconsider the value of work and what we mean by working.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting too that you mentioned Anthony Townsend, because he's been looking at cities for a very long time and working in them and working in technology. And I think his comment to me was like, have you seen someone successfully make maintenance a political thing that they're proud to talk about? You know, like, imagine a leader being like, I'm going to invest in maintenance. And it's funny because when I think that's starting to happen in New York, and people are very excited to see that's, you know, that could be what a mayor would talk about. Like, that's fantastic. But in Anthony being in New York, but I think the specifics of technology maintenance in the world of private sector technology development, you're constantly working on the product, right? But in terms of on the side where we receive a product or we use it, or we put it into operations, or say we have it in, there's so many different ways we use technology, but basically there's a lot of work we need to do to make sure that it keeps working the way that we want it to work. There's so many cases where you use a new software, a new tool, and you're like, oh, this isn't designed to do this the way I want to do it. And then you start like working around it. You're like, okay, well, I guess I'll just start a spreadsheet over here, and then I'll go over there and I'll copy paste this way. And I think the shift, and this gets to the concept that I'm very excited and working on now, of a term called halfway technology. So by accident, this is completely by accident, this is a good example of when this happens. I found this book when I was going for a walk. And it's called The Culture of Technology by Arnold Pacey. It's from 1983. It's really good. And in it, he brings up this term, and it comes from medicine, but it's the idea of a halfway technology. So the idea is that so high technology in medicine would be, let's take the example of a vaccine. A vaccine, it has a narrow purpose. it's tested. And when you deploy it, it does what it's supposed to do. And you can set up an infrastructure around it to make sure it can be accessed. So that in medical terminology would be a high technology. A halfway technology is something where it's like maybe in medicine, a treatment rather than addressing a root cause. And so what Arnold Pacey does, and I'll get to maintenance here in this book, is he says most of the technologies, and this is before the internet, so 1983, but what he brings forward, lots of different cases of technology, is that it's developed to a point and it's put to the market, but it's not high technology. You know, if we think about internet, I would say AI is a good halfway technology, cell phones, general purpose software. These are technologies that are developed to a point, and then it's sort of like, over to you. And what he's trying to do in this book, and what I'm now, borrowing this term to try to point to, is we're very focused on the narrow part of like technology, like the product and how it works and is it standards compliant, whatever. But most of the life of a technology happens on the demand side, when it's put into operations, when it becomes part of your workflow, when it becomes part of your life, when it becomes part of, you getting access to your kids' homework, or a community using a message board or whatever else. The second half is up to the receiver of the technology and its implementation. Like, these technologies are not being released to us finished, especially the ones that are venture capital based, where scaling is the goal. So you kind of develop it to a point that you can unleash it anywhere with no context, without an understanding of anything local or the city or whatever else, or the organization. So why I think this term is super helpful is that instead of us constantly looking to the supply side to keep saying the product's bad, or it's not working, or we don't know what it's doing, or it should have a warranty, it's like, in an ideal world, we'd be receiving high technologies that are very narrow, consistent, designed for us. They know our sector, they know our industry, they're great. That's not what a lot of these technologies are that we're struggling with. So rather than keep staring at the supply side, it's to look at our power, which is, well, when we receive one of these, if we understand that there's going to be all kinds of issues, we have to invest in the people around it who sit around it, see how it's working and not working in use, or can see, you know what, this actually doesn't fit. Or you try something and you say, okay, we have to remove this. So having investments in the people that are responsible to either maintain, adapt, remove, change technology, to me, there's a lot more potential for all of us to feel a lot more power on the receiving side, because at the end of the day, staring at companies and hoping they do a better thing, I think has had pretty limited results. So if we invest in the people that make decisions around the technology, around its governance, I think there's a lot more we can do, and a lot more authority that you can exert if you stop expecting the thing to come at you perfect, because it's not going to. That's not going to happen. So what do we do in response on the side of those receiving and paying or not paying if it's free? So I think that's not maintenance in the typical sense of like maintaining the product, which will live with the product owner, but in terms of maintaining the conditions of how it's used. That's a place where, rather than putting so much money into technology, you can put money into staffing, into people, into resourcing, so that you can mitigate what harms you might see, or you can hold vendors and producers a lot more accountable, because you're expecting that that's part of a job. Like a lot of the time here, this is unleashed, and then everyone's left like this, and they're yelling at the government, regulate it. So the government doesn't want to regulate it too hard because it's going to hurt the bottom line. So that model would be nice, but that's not happening. So what do we do instead? And I think looking to maintenance as a place for investment has a lot of potential, but that's like medium long term, right? Then you have to be willing to make organizational design changes. You have to invest in people. It's counterculture to, both capital, public or private, it doesn't matter. There's an efficiency culture we live in. So there's a lot of reason to automate where you can, even if it's imperfect. But I think we have more power to be careful with that in the public sector than in the private sector.
So that's also a way of like making more visible an invisible work, actually, like
Yes.
to value what today is not at all considered what you are sharing. And I guess maybe it's part actually of larger philosophy of care,
Yes.
maybe, no, what you're sharing.
Very much so. And I think, like, if I don't know about you, but I think these swings of looking at AI as either, you know, big threat because, you know, I'm not even sure what sci-fi threats are the latest. We've, you know, last year they kept popping up and saying, oh my God, this might happen. I think that labor, you know, is a very good place to just focus on what happens when you automate decision makings. Labor and relationships, most of us have some sense of how to engage on issues of labor and relationships. And I think with labor and relationships, and this is where we come to culture and to why I think regulation is getting asked to do way too much. Some of the questions we have about technology and society, they're not right or wrong questions. They're not like, is this good or is this bad? There's a question just of how do you want to live together? You know, there's a great book by Wendell Berry. It's called Against Modern Superstition. And he talks about that he sees the time coming of people who want to live as creatures and people who want to live as machines. And neither of those are wrong. I don't think it's, you know, I know myself, but I know people who really enjoy a machine style existence. And like, we have to figure out the kind of conditions where people who want to live in different ways can coexist. And that's kind of the crux of democracy. So if we accept that a lot of these technical issues are actually cultural questions, we also stop screaming about regulation, because regulation is only going to get you so far. We've been regulating for 30 years. I don't think people feel in control of the way technology is impacting society. I can't look, and I also don't think law is supposed to be in charge of everything. Like, that's not how this is supposed to work either. So I think there's a lot of room to do things differently, but we have to stop being, I think, so focused on the supply side and on the vendor and on who's producing, because, like, yes, let's hold them accountable and not stop trying, but we have to have a pluralist approach to our responses. So I think maintenance and care and looking at some of these questions of labor and of relationship, and urban planning is a good example. Like, there are professional ethics. So instead of asking every question from ground zero, you look at a code of ethics and you say, does the use of this technology in my practice as a certified professional uphold this code of ethics? And across every professional function, you can ask those questions. Like, we don't need to start at zero all the time. And I think that's also why when you started to speak today about decision-making and ethics, another book recommendation, The AI Con. This is a very great book. One of the things in this book is that the authors organize the automation of decisions as a different category than, say, the creation of content, right? Like a chat GPT, like there's all kinds of cultural issues about reading and writing and synthesizing and knowledge and environment, like all kinds of stuff down that track, different set of issues than a decision being taken by a machine or the consequence. I think there's a very gray area right now where people are looking at saying, well, the machine, especially in government, the computer didn't make the decision, it recommended it. And then the human in the loop actually made the decision or confirmed it. But psychologically speaking, it's something to go against the machine, right? Like that. So you can tell me that the person made the decision, but if you're going to tell me that it's just as likely that you go for it or go against it, or what are the consequences of absorbing the work of going against an automated decision. And I just want to say one more thing, because I'm trying to bring us back to some of these issues we're facing right now with geopolitical instability. And so Ursula Franklin, who is a beloved technology scholar, activist, pacifist, feminist, she's from Toronto. She passed away, should know what year, but she's not with us anymore. But she did a series of lectures in 1989, and they're called The Real World of Technology. I'm somewhere here. But basically, what she talked about, and she'd been in a forced labor camp in Nazi Germany. This is a little, it's concise and great and very timeless. But she talked about the fact that automation and technologies, they can really destroy a sense of reciprocity, to bring it back to care. They can destroy a sense of reciprocity. And that when you start to have a culture of convenience, and I think this is, I keep seeing pieces talk about friction, and I think there was a piece recently about friction maxing. But when you live a life where everything's very easy, you start to lose your capacity to deal with the minor frictions that are just part of having relationships with other people. And she draws a line between that idea of compliance with what happens when you have an authoritarian in power. Because you are out of practice with dealing with things that are like a little bit, you know, like, oh, I have to resist this thing, or I have to step out of line. And she talks a lot about technology in the workplace, making it very, she uses the terms prescriptive and holistic technologies. Holistic technologies, she says, you're in charge of them. You use them how you want. Prescriptive technologies, like most software, either you use it or you don't. You don't have a lot of choices about how you use it. The point is that there's a lot of compliance thinking that starts to happen with these technologies we use, where it's just too much work not to use it. You know, you look at it and you say, you know what, like, I don't like this thing, but if I'm not going to use it, then I'm going to have to go escalate through this form or this person or whatever. It's going to take me 75 minutes, or I'm just going to use the app, right? So these things do have a broader consequential political impact on us. It's just not a straight line, like, oh, you know, we're automated society, things are easier, but there is a cultural consequence to not practicing dealing with minor conflict, you know, and minor irritation or disturbance. And I think we see this all the time. I think about this in my neighborhood, like, everyone deserves to be cared for, whether they're kind or not, or nice or not, or they're good or they're not. Like, good is the wrong word. They're good to you or they're not. Doesn't matter. We're not supposed to be having a competition here. It's everyone deserves to have care and to be taken care of by the systems that we all share. So I think this is where, when we go too narrow on trying to do technical governance, I think we miss this bigger picture of what's happening to us sort of socially and culturally. And that's why working on things like maintenance and working in a way of repair and care, it really focuses on the people involved and the people working together to manage the technology. Because I think that's also a viable economy, you know, like, that's a different way to think about what we value and what we pay for. And I think that's on the table, because you have to have some sort of a response in terms of what this looks like, you know, on a more macro level.
Well, thanks for sharing, Bianca. On what you just shared, I'm just sharing, like, because it really resonates strongly with two previous episodes. We had a conversation with Chiara Natali on frictional AI. She's actually submitting her thesis right now. So she's doing her PhD on this topic, and it's very close to what you're sharing. So how we can inject intentional friction on design technology. And on this idea that we are focusing too much sometimes, you know, if some people also want to go further on this idea, I welcome Dan Hill. It was a few weeks ago, and he used the image of soft eyes and hard eyes to describe what you're sharing. So soft eyes is when you see the whole picture, and hard eyes is when you are too focused. Have a look to this episode. That was really also fascinating. We have in the comments many questions, so I really want to ask them to you. By the way, I see Greg. Hi, Greg. Great to have you in the comments.
Hi, Greg.
And we had a question quite well, actually, with Time and Space Studio, because he said also we had a conflation in our language in general between technology and products. So that was his comments. And it's actually connecting to another question I wanted to ask you, because in your in Time and Space Studio, in your website, you're sharing that you learned that it's what matters is to change the conversation, to better frame the conversation, I think is your terms. So can you tell us more about Time and Space Studio, and also why you believe that powers lies in the conversations, in a sense?
Yes, and thank you. And I agree with what I think Greg was saying, this distinction here with the product and capability. Like we have so little non-commercial technology to even refer to, unfortunately. And I think when you start reading like engineering and other discipline, which if we go back to Arnold Pacey, because I think this matters and it gets to Time and Space Studio's question too, talks about the danger, and I think we can all feel this, of a very narrow set of technocratic expertise driving the development of so much of what's going on. And it just does not take into consideration what happens when these products are unleashed into civil society. So even the best meaning technocrat or technical expert or product manager or whatever just doesn't have the range to see out into the consequences. And this is also why it's unrealistic to ask developers to be held accountable for things that they can't even see. Like that's also unfair, is to say, well, you're in charge of all of the secondary consequences of this use. And it's like, yeah, but I didn't even know that could happen, right? So I think we have to be realistic about how to share the load here. So in terms of the Time and Space Studios, what I realized after the end of the better part of 10 years working in this policy space, which happened by accident, is that, and there's a macro to this too, it's very abstract. And I think we all need to ask ourselves, a lot of dehumanization happens in the abstract. A lot of dehumanization happens when people are turned into data. This is as old as a census. This is nothing to do with just modern technology. And while it's necessary to talk at the abstract, legal, policy, framework, principle, guideline, like you name it, we've got a lot of those. We've got codes of ethics, we've got whatever. So my instinct and my desire to start a studio came from the fact that I want to return to the grounding and the accountability that happens when you work in a very narrow contextual example of a technology in practice, of an organization, of a location. So when I used to run public meetings, I knew that if I didn't do the job well, I would have a hard time showing my face in that neighborhood again. That is a very fundamental tenet of responsibility, integrity, even in your work. So for me personally, I think AI, it kind of broke my brain at a point, because I was in rooms where I was like, you know what, man, just say, anyone here can say whatever they want. It doesn't have to be historically accurate. No one in the room here has touched any of the products they're talking about. There's no one in the room that's actually impacted by them. And this is, again, this is personal to me. So for some people, and we need people to be around those tables to grapple with this stuff at the macro, I think there's a lot more opportunity for myself to take what I learned in my facilitation practice, which is that when you reorganize discussions, you can get to conditions where things feel better for everyone involved in terms of their power, their influence. So with technology specifically, I'd like to help people put it in its appropriately sized box, which to me is small. And that in a lot of cases, it just reframing and reorganizing conversations for people to say, like, look, you run this small business. Great. Sometimes I laugh because you've got these Canadian AI institutes being like, small, medium-sized business, they're not adopting AI quick enough. And I'm like, maybe because they know it's just going to create a mess. Like, that might be a very well-informed decision, is not to introduce automation when, like, what is it doing for me, right? So just trying to bring the same grounding that a public engagement process does to technology conversations with people that need to have them at a contextual, high integrity level to say, look, you got all the laws will not save you. You like this may be regulated, there may be policy, there may be an infrastructure plan, blah, blah, blah. You are still going to be sitting here going, what do I do about this stuff? So the point of the studio is to take that idea of halfway technology and say, look, you've got a lot of it. Let's see what you've got. And then let's try to reorganize the power dynamic because you're paying for this. So how do you manage vendors differently? How do you set up procurements differently? How do you make implementation plans? How do you look at your workflows? How do you get out of a bad contract? That is like one of the most innovative things that public agencies can do is stop getting taken advantage of. Because if you look at what's out in the market right now, this isn't like, oh, I wonder if we're getting a good or bad deal. It's like completely torqued to the vendor side. And the reason that I want to work on this with people who don't have a technology background is because so much of this happens because it's this mystique of like, oh, I'm not a technical person, so I'm just going to have to take this at face value. It's like, no, you don't. This is bullshit. Like, but you need the confidence from someone who knows that something could be many, many different ways. So that's what I'd like to work on. And that's what I'm starting to sort of talk to people about and how to be helpful. And finally, we have to realize that a lot of IT, when we set up like departments and, oh, I look at IT, I look at tech and whatever, it was sort of like just plumbing, if you will. Like it was administrative. A lot of it still is, to be clear. But as the technology sector starts encroaching into subject matter design, it's sort of like, okay, a lot of leaders don't want to think about IT. In the Canadian government, at the federal level, like the real I'm important people in the government, they don't think it's interesting to talk about tech. They're kind of like, yeah, whatever, that's delivery. I'm up here in my high-minded culture of policy, right? So in a lot of organizations, it's the same. It's not like an appealing place, but the problem is there's a lot of like power and money getting lost because it's just sort of like hived off and stuck in like a kind of like 90s minded way of thinking about it. So that's the purpose of the studio, is to set up a place where not only can help people like see what they got and talk about it in normal language, that's their confidence areas, but also, this is why I've got sort of like, what do you call it? Like things with me here. I like analog things, and a lot of people do too. So because software and stuff is intangible and abstract, the idea is to start building models with people as well, to say like, look, man, let's just like sit down and look, let's like build something so you can see all the people this product touches in your team and how, and like, let's like really look at this again, so that it's not just flying around invisibly, but that we start to consider it in operations with people using words that we're all familiar with. Because I will close by saying the reason that a lot of what passes for like, oh, well, this is inevitable, this is the future, is because people don't want to look stupid. So then they don't talk, and then it's quiet, and then everybody's like this. And for me, it's been such a persistent thing in my life that when I start saying something, people are like, oh yeah, I hate that thing. I'm like, I know, you're not alone. It's because it's bad. Like, it's not like, oh, it needs a big critique. This is a bad idea. But it feels scary to say that. And you would think that this shouldn't be such a big power, but it is. Politicians have this problem. They don't want to look like they're not innovative. We actually have a long and deep culture of admiration for innovation and newness. We have engineers who talk, you can go back centuries and like, oh, look at the cathedrals we've built. Like, sometimes you need to understand that people really think that if they don't innovate, they're doing a bad thing. Like, they have a responsibility to bring these new things to bear. That's just part of the culture. That's a dominant Western culture. So can we respond to that differently? I think a lot of that comes to, got another book recommendation here. It's a really good book called Freedom is an Endless Meeting. Is like slowing down for long enough. And that's time and space too. Time, the function of time. Can we hold enough time to stop and be like, what are we even doing? You would be shocked how many conversations I have. They start the start of an hour. Someone's like, oh, what do I do? And at the end of an hour, they're like, why did I get so turned upside down by this stuff? Like it's wild. So I think practicing how we talk about it, and your show is doing this here, and I love that. It's part of it, even though it doesn't lead to an outcome. It's that we have to practice talking and like, is this repeatable? Can we keep talking? Can we slow down long enough? And I think there's a lot of wisdom in large project management about just slowing down to do it right, so that when you actually do it, you're in control. And I can't remember his name. There's a book called How Big Things Get Done, I think. That is like the number one piece of advice, is slow the hell down at the start so that you can actually do it properly. And you would be shocked how hard it is to get people to slow down in that sense of pressure and urgency that this industry absolutely relies on people getting sucked into. People, every institution, every location in life, they feel pressured to adopt this stuff. And if it's good, cool, then give us a bit of time and then we'll figure out what to do. But these are cultural factors, and that's, I think, a lot of opportunity to work with people who want to, just approach this differently rather than from a place of like fear and pressure.
I really love all the elements, each by each. You share the fact that we need to have more face-to-face interaction, and that in a sense there is accountability, ethics in the face, basically. And obviously you have many amazing philosophers that were also saying it, and it's really, I agree, this is really a beautiful idea also to find again proportionality in everything and to slow time. That's more than ever needed, and I think it's a good way of starting this year, those words. I just want to share quickly some gems in the comments, because I see that it's already, unfortunately, the end of the episode. But we have Nick Kaufman, Tenderness, with website and applications, but focused on distributing love and tenderness. Well, beautiful project. Thanks for sharing, Nick.
Yes.
And we got also a book recommendation. I can't find the comment. Maybe it was in the beginning, which was, well, actually we had many book recommendations. So I think, Bianca, the books you shared inspired many other people. Charles Finlay, hi Charles, who shared Culture of Technology. And we had also Jens Ertz, I hope I well pronounced your name, who also shared an amazing book, indeed, Smart City, Putting Technology in Its Place to Reclaim Our Urban Future.
Beautiful. I have to, can I just interject? Bianca, I have to tell you something fast, because I have these 3 books here.
Of course.
I have 3 books because I think it helps people know that we can't do much more than talk. These are 3 books that look at Indigenous relations in Canada and advocacy: Voltaire's Bastards, which looks at Western rationalism, and Silent Spring, which is about the climate crisis. And this is the beginning of the environmental movement, some say, in some, again, Western historical terms. All 3 of these books end with the thesis, we just need to work on it more together. Okay. So that's why talking, it might not seem, this is Ursula Franklin, very famous too. She was a Quaker, and she talked about a thing called scrupling, where if you don't necessarily know what you're going to get out of the conversation, but you have to work on it anyway. You just have to stay with the trouble. That's Donna Haraway. You just got to like stay in the conversation, even if you don't know where it's going to go. And maybe you just talk sometimes and you don't get to a solution. That's part of the longer term work we have to do together. So sorry, I just want to make sure people know, like, we have to get out of the solutionist mindset. We have to talk more and spend time inefficiently talking and sharing, because each of us brings a different thing to the conversation.
Amazing. Thanks a lot, Julie, Bianca, for the fascinating, inspiring, energizing episode. Thanks also for all the book recommendations. Really, I think we have a lot to read now for the next months. That's already the end of the episode. It was a true pleasure of welcoming you. I really wish you all the best, success, but not only success, meaning, and you already have it, impact with Time and Space Studio. And I'm really looking forward to discovering the incoming projects you will have. Thanks to all of you for your active participation and your fascinating insight and comments. And we will see again, I think it will be in 3 weeks, maybe a bit less, with Ben van Berkel, who is the founding architect of UN Studio. So we'll be more talking about AI and architecture this time. And until this time, take care, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks,
Thank you
Bianca.
so much, everyone. Bye.